Hello, my name is Mike Rivnak. I'm a volunteer here at the Tecumseh Historical Museum. We're open on Saturdays, so if you're in town for shopping or perhaps an event in town or maybe even the farmer's market, stop by and see us. We're located at 302 East Chicago Boulevard. If you've been through town, you've probably seen the old stone church downtown. Well, that's where we're at, so please stop by and visit us. You can also visit us online at www.historictecumseh.org. There you'll find a lot of events and also our bookstore. So if you're looking for some books or gifts, please feel free to take a look at the bookstore. The museum houses our archives from Tecumseh's historic past. Admission is free, so that should fit into just about anybody's budget. Today I'll be talking about the early years in Tecumseh, how it was settled, and a bit about the challenges and struggles that the first group of pioneers faced when they arrived in Tecumseh in 1824. In a few years, we're going to be celebrating Tecumseh's 200th anniversary. The first group of 22 settlers that arrived in 1824 were from New York mostly. That of course would change as time went on and migration would bring many more people into this area. Our archives include many personal letters, journals, and books about early Tecumseh and what life was like here. So we get a pretty good picture of really what it was like on day one in Tecumseh. We'll use these journals and letters and a few stories to let the pioneers tell their own story on how Tecumseh was settled. You'll learn it was not a sure thing, that Tecumseh was not always a sure thing that it would make it, that the village would survive and move on. But what you will learn is the sacrifices that these pioneers and settlers made to make Tecumseh a special place as it is today. I want to talk a little bit about the opening of the frontier. Following the Revolutionary War, there was a migration of people from the original 13 colonies west towards what they considered at that point to be the Old Northwest, which was Ohio, Indiana, and at that point the territory of Michigan. Michigan still wasn't a state. Ohio was settled in 1803, Indiana in 1816, and as I said, Michigan at the time Tecumseh was settled was still a territory. So it was natural really for that migration to spill into the Michigan territory. At the time, there were very few towns, viable towns in the area. Detroit, Toledo, and Monroe were there, but they were very small settlements at that point in time and not very civilized, not a lot of civilization, I should say. The area around Lenawee County at the time was very heavily forested. A vast, abundant forest with trees and wildlife, so it was really a wonderful wilderness, a beautiful wilderness, as the pioneers said when they first arrived. They talked especially about the abundance of wild grapes and wild strawberries. As you know, Tecumseh was settled in June of 1824, which would be about the right time when the wild strawberries would be in season. So we imagine when they showed up, one of the first things they noticed were those beautiful wild strawberries. Of course, wild game was plentiful. Deer and beaver were very prominent in this area. Of course, not only from a subsistence standpoint from deer, but also the beaver hides and pelts were used and were very highly prized at that time back east for various things like top hats were made of beaver hats at that point in time. For most of the settlers, they write about why did they come here. They write about their willingness to strike out on their own, their sense of adventure, which is really that true pioneering spirit that motivated them to look for a new life on the frontier, because at that point, Tecumseh was really considered the frontier. Their real reasons for coming here are likely very personal, and we see that in their letters and journals. So what did Tecumseh look like in 1824? We think it was a wild, isolated, untamed wilderness. In fact, it really wasn't. At the time, there were a lot of Native American tribes in this area that migrated in and around Tecumseh. Obviously there were streams, Evans Creek and River Raisin, were great sources for water. The area just east of Tecumseh, we consider they called it the dancing grounds. And this was an ancient ceremonial site that was used by the Native Americans for important events in their life. The dancing grounds are on the site of the convergence of two major routes and trails in the area. And these are Native American trails that go back centuries. We think they were, at some point, were ancient migration routes for animals that were, moving through the area. In today's terms, the dancing ground was really like a freeway interchange. It had a good area to camp, a good water source, good food sources nearby. There were obviously strawberries, wild grapes, and we also know that the Native Americans planted orchards of plums in the area. So we know that there were some wild plums there as well. So anyway, this dancing ground was really at the, kind of a freeway interchange and had a lot of good resources around. So right here in Tecumseh, we don't think it was, necessarily, so the first settlers, some of them showed up here in Michigan before the first settlers arrived. We know that there were some surveyors originally that were trying to lay a route between Detroit and Chicago. This route followed what they called the Great Sauk Trail and is currently the route of the US 12 as it runs through Michigan, through southern Michigan. Others that came to this area before Tecumseh settled were land speculators. They were out looking for the best area to settle, to lay claim to that land and obviously make some money selling land. One of those surveyors that visited southern Michigan was a guy by the name of Musgrove Evans. He was a surveyor, grew up back east around Philadelphia, and was very familiar with the trails of southern Michigan. He'd likely traveled throughout this area as he was out looking for military contracts for surveying. We know that at one point he traveled over what they call the La Passance Trail, which is currently Route 50, travels along Route 50 from Monroe to Tecumseh. So we know that Musgrove Evans was around this area quite a bit, at least before Tecumseh was settled. Musgrove Evans had a relative that lived in Monroe. His name was Austin Eli Wing. Mr. Wing was very well connected in the Michigan territorial government. He was the private secretary to Lewis Cass, who at the time was the Michigan territorial governor. So Evans came back from his trip, talked to Wing, said, hey, we got some great land, we think, around Tecumseh. And at some point, Evans, Wing, and a small surveying party left Monroe, and we figure it was sometime towards the later part of 1823, and went into Lenawee County looking for great land to develop and some opportunities there. They followed the La Passance Trail from Monroe across the vast cottonwood swamp that used to be between Monroe and Tecumseh, and eventually they came to the area around the dancing grounds. Once they arrived, they found that there were several abandoned Indian, Native American teepees in the area. And you can see from this picture of this teepee that these were actually quite different from the Plains teepees. They were more rounded, did not look like anything like the teepees from the Plains Indians. So Evans and Wing spent a few days. They looked around, found some beautiful parcels of land. They realized that the potential around Tecumseh was really great. It was a great area, a good water source. As I mentioned, they had good land. The land looked really good. Wildlife was around, so they figured it was a great area to lay claim. Evans and Wing, they hurried back to Monroe and started making plans to develop Tecumseh. In the next few days, they purchased land at the land office in Monroe for $1.25 an acre. These were the first parcels of land to be laid claim in Tecumseh. The next thing Musgrove Evans did was contacted his brother-in-law, a gentleman by the name of Joseph Brown in western New York. We know he was at some point interested in moving to the frontier, and so Evans reaches out to Brown, and Brown agrees to come to Michigan and try to settle the area. Of course, Evans was the surveyor. Brown had had some experience as a farmer and a miller, so his talents, of course, fit very well with the need for a new community. And of course, Wing was the political connection. He was the guy behind the scenes that was really going to make it happen from a government standpoint. Brown, towards the end of 1823, starts to organize the first group of about 20 or so pioneers that would be the first settlers in Tecumseh. And this brings us to the year of 1824, when the first settlers would arrive on their trip to Tecumseh. So, how'd the first settlers get here? The first pioneers come to Tecumseh? Well, let's imagine a trip from Western New York to Tecumseh today. Freeways, airline travel, trains. It's very easy, conceivable that somebody could make that trip in perhaps one day. But of course, in 1824, there were no roads. There were no motels, no restaurants, no facilities of any kind. Detroit, Toledo, and Monroe were still at the time very small communities. The rest of the region was a frontier. So they loaded up, the first pioneers coming from Western New York, loaded up all of their possessions into their wagons, animals, family, everybody in the wagon, the animals trailing behind, all of their possessions in that wagon, and they took off from Western New York to Buffalo. Buffalo was on the eastern end of Lake Erie. From there, they took a schooner, which was a wind-powered watercraft that went from Buffalo across Lake Erie and obviously to the western frontier. At the time, though, Lake Erie wasn't a sure thing to get across Lake Erie. It was very dangerous, especially at certain times of year when the weather would pick up terribly. But it took them a couple weeks really to get across from Buffalo into Michigan. So once they arrived, most of them ended up going to Detroit, which at that time was, as I said, was a very small community. For one family, the Osborne family, they landed in Detroit, took on some provisions, and started for Tecumseh. Their route was to go from Detroit to Monroe, and then from Monroe to Tecumseh. The trip from Detroit to Monroe took them about 2 weeks. Surprisingly, because there were no roads in the area. They had to build some bridges and ford rivers. Of course, they had their wagon with animals trailing behind, oxen and horses and cows and such. So it was a slow go. It took them 2 weeks, as I said, to get to Monroe. There they found a Native American guide who took them the last 30 miles from Monroe to Tecumseh in about 6 days. Of course, this is across the Cottonwood Swamp, and again, it was a very slow go. So all in all, I mean, this trip these folks took from Western New York took them about 6 weeks. It wasn't an easy trip. So June 2nd, 1824 is considered to be day one at Tecumseh. And that was the day the first group of settlers arrived in Tecumseh near the dancing grounds over the trail from Monroe. Their first letters home tell of the natural beauty of the area, the abundant wildlife, the promise of good ground for farming. The pioneers likely camped the first few nights, of course. They didn't have any shelter, either that or they had tents or overturned wagons to provide some at least bit of shelter. But of course, the first thing they were going to do was build some type of structure, a house or a cabin, and that work began immediately. That was their first priority. In another video from the Tecumseh Historical Society, we talk about that first log cabin in Pioneer Park, and there's a boulder there today to commemorate that day in June 1824 when those first settlers started to build that first log cabin here in Tecumseh. There were very crude furniture. They had stumps for chairs, and it wasn't really in a few weeks before the actual chairs and beds and all those things started to arrive. So very crude start from the beginning. So the next priority, of course, is food. Almost from day one, they began to plant crops. The ground was dug either by hand or by a team of oxen if they could break up the ground. The ground had really never seen a plow before. This is native ground. So it was full of vines and roots, and it made a very difficult task at first to get that ground turned over so they could plant. It wasn't until really they obtained a large wooden plow, it's called a smith plow, where they could really make real progress in breaking up the ground for the first time. So what did they plant? Same as today. They planted corn, wheat, grasses for the animals. Joseph Brown in his letters writes that on day 2 he planted a garden near the cabin with peas, beans, radishes, cucumbers, melons, lettuce, and cabbage, much like today's gardens. Wildlife was also supplemented their diets. As I said, turkey, squirrel, and whatever else they could find. Again, the wild strawberries were in season, so they probably enjoyed those, and the plums in the orchard. We thought that the Native Americans may have planted beforehand. And from their letters, we know also that their Native American neighbors also helped them with food and how to get along in those first few days. So as soon as they began to get things organized, of course, in the beginning, one of the most important things to do was to lay out the village. Again, this is a wilderness. There was no roads, so the first thing that Musgrove Evans did when he came here was to try to lay out that village. Now again, Musgrove Evans had been here before, so I think he recognized, or we feel that he recognized, that the area west of the River Raisin was an ideal place. It was a flat plateau, and is currently where the downtown area is in Tecumseh. So Musgrove picked out a good area for the downtown. He laid out very wide roads in the area, which gives us that beautiful downtown that we see today in Tecumseh, very distinctive appearance of the downtown. So they set aside 4 parcels of land to be used as public grounds in the new village. This land was donated by the Tecumseh Land Company. Austin Wing, Musgrove Evans, and Joseph Brown donated this land to Tecumseh. There were 4 parcels, as I said. Number 1 was a county courthouse. Again, this was none of the area around here was developed. It was just a vast wilderness. It was a territory. So they set aside a partial of that ground for public buildings, and that area was near Chicago Boulevard and Maumee Street. The second parcel of land was a military square that they used for training the militia, and that area was near where the current public library is. Another one was a public park or a promenade that was currently near where the city hall is today. And lastly, the burial ground, which we know was near the current Elliott Park, just outside of Tecumseh, outside of the downtown area. These were the first public spaces which were filed with the Michigan Territorial Land Office in Monroe on June 26, 1824. So that's when the first plats of land, the public land, was set aside for the village. Evans was the surveyor, and he laid out these public grounds using a compass, his compass that he brought with him from back east. In our museum, we have that artifact. We have Evans's actual compass that he used to lay out the city in June of 1824. It's a really cool exhibit to have. The compass itself was, we feel, was manufactured around in the early 1800s, probably about 1810 or 1815. It was made in New York City, which is really quite unique because back then all scientific instruments came from Europe. We can also see the French influence on the design of this compass. The French fleur-de-lis design is at the north position, which again gives us that French influence and the European influence for scientific instruments. So the next priority was to build a sawmill and a grist mill. Obviously you need to continue to eat and you need to continue to build houses. The good news was there's plenty of trees around here. So they started chopping down lumber, trees for lumber, usually around the Red Mill Pond. It was the place they first started. First things they did, of course, was try to build some crude log cabins, get out of the cold and get out of the elements. And this is really where Joseph Brown came into his element because he was a skilled miller, had run grist mills and sawmills before. So, his expertise was vital to the beginning of the community. Any prospering community needs frame houses, windows and doors and furniture, and that's what they set out to do from the beginning. As I said, they damped up Red Mill Pond and fell some lumber, and Without concrete, this was slow and hard work, but they were able to get most of it done by November of the first year, and started sawing lumber right around the same time. So it was not long after that that Joseph Brown built his first house in 1824, and that was the first house in Tecumseh and in Lenawee County. So the next thing you need, of course, is a millstone. You want to grind flour, grain into grist. And as we mentioned, you know, the steel plow was important to get that so they could break up the ground and start the first farming. And another priority was a millstone. These millstones were used to grind the grains into grist and even finer into wheat flour that they could make into bread and cakes and such. The grooves were cut into the millstone were an important part of the process. The millstones were several feet in diameter. So the first wheat was harvested in Tecumseh around the end of June 1826. That wheat was used for the first 4th of July celebration in Tecumseh in 1826. Musgrove Evans and Joseph Brown, Austin Wing, decided to throw a celebration in town. So that wheat that was ground on the morning of July 4th was the first wheat that was manufactured in Tecumseh and in Lenawee County. I would like to thank everybody for the opportunity to talk with you today. Again, we look forward to seeing you at the museum. We have a lot of fun at the museum talking with people. Come on in. We have a great amount of archives, history books relating to the Tecumseh history. We enjoy the visitors just as much as I think they enjoy coming in, because we learn a lot from them, and look forward to you coming in and teaching us. Anyway, if you have an opportunity, please stop by. We have a wonderful bookstore with some gifts and book ideas, and would also encourage you to go online and visit our website, and hopefully you can support our museum. We are a nonprofit organization, so all the proceeds from the book sales and gift sales go directly to the museum, and we are only here through your support. So we appreciate your patronage and look forward to seeing you in the Tecumseh Museum. Thank you.